Morning, friends. I feel like the two tutorials I did at OSCON yesterday were huge. I'm still thinking about both. I didn't even talk about the cryptocurrencies one in my most recent YouTube, which I'm continuing. There's a lot of chronology to what I do, but I was talking mostly about the Rust language tutorial. And now going back yet another video or two, I think one or two, techno invective. I did catch that typo on my YouTube title, techno invection. I got that, but I think I wanted to go back and say some more about that. I think partly what Ed Applewhite was discovering was this was the early days of the internet. He was old school pre-internet, right? He was in his 80s, and when he came out here to Portland to talk to me, and I think he might have written this before he came out. I'll check the dates actually. That's a good question. I have all that on the record, but uh, on the internet, people got a lot more crass. You could say it wasn't diplomatic anymore. It was like we're just kids, we're gamers, we're gonna take the gloves off and like duke it out and kind of all in the family kind of TV was getting edgy. Let's call it edgy if we don't want to call it crass. And I think partly what Applewhite was seeing was, in looking over my shoulder, he was seeing the future of the internet culture and finding it somewhat offensive. But then I was kind of doing it in an arty way. But I think techno invective is another term for edgy in some ways. And you may have seen my kind of funny YouTube where was that? I think in Santa Clara. I'm at a PyCon and I have the wild hair look and I'm giving a talk about tractors and socialist realism and how we could teach Python using this kind of faux Russian propaganda. If you remember, the tractor was lionized. Anyway, it's an interesting talk. It's kind of funny. I was pre-Russiagate. It was pre all that. So anyway, we've gone through a lot. Like I've got a old. Let me get off this picture. We're going on with the Dymaxion House here. I've got an old World's Whole Earth magazine, not the catalog, which was big, right? Big format. But then there was a Whole Earth Review, I think it was called. And I have one issue which is looking forward to kind of an American-Russian convergence, kind of almost like a merger. And I can imagine how that drove the Cold Warriors wild at the time, right? And this was all part of that hippie rebellion, I suppose, quote unquote. I'm talking about the Dymaxion neighborhood again. This is a kind of a famous picture I saw in the Chicago Museum of Modern Art when I was at a PyCon there near O'Hare Airport. We took the train in, Steve Holden, Ian Benson, and myself, to see this museum exhibit, and they had this is actually a diorama, like a mock-up with actual little plastic people. But what I say you don't see in this picture is none of these people are paying a mortgage. Plus, they'll swap out your house for a newer model. It's kind of like getting a cell phone. You pay your monthly, but it's like not that much, and you don't get saddled with ownership. So when it goes out of date, it's not your problem, and all this stuff is recyclable. And the reason it didn't happen, there's a lot of reasons. Partly, I think the pressure on Bucky after the car incident, somebody was killed, and they say it's because the car flipped, but the stories I've read said it was run off the road. And that's a very sore point in Bucky's whole chapter. I mean, you should never underestimate the impact that had. And I think why he was tentative with the house and not wanting to like put all his eggs in the house basket is because it was all going to be pinned on him if it crashed, and he didn't want to go down in history as having wrecked this industry. Much easier to hand it on, and I think I don't blame him for his choice. Little darlings, all I've said so far, and I may end it here, it's the shortest review I've ever done, if so, was a long cigarette commercial. Go watch it and you'll see what I mean. Getting kids hooked on tobacco products. That's the main what I saw there. But there's some other subplots, but that's the main plot. Okay, so partly why I'm not in a tutorial right now is I bit off as much as I could chew yesterday, and I'm hosting. I've got house guests leaving today and arriving, and the one is an international, and won't see this person much for a long time probably. So it's time to talk business and so on. And I think using Python semantic analysis with Python and the graph database thing I was looking forward to. And I'm still thinking if we're serious about like high school, letting kids have a graph database with who knows who in recent times, like start with the Greenwich Village generations, because Fuller was one of those actually. Before Jack Kerouac and all that, Allen Ginsberg, there was a generation in which Fuller and Noguchi were part of the scene in Greenwich Village, kind of beatnik, you could say. We forget that that's kind of where Fuller started. And his dress choices kind of came out of that. He realized that he'd get further if he, quote, dressed like a banker. So it was all ties and three-piece suits after that, pretty much. But out here in the Northwest, we cultivated what we call grunge. And out here, even if you're very wealthy, it's still, because we're engineers, like watch the movie Titanic to get the idea of what engineers are like. In that movie, you kind of get a stereotype. It's total stereotype, but stereotypes can be useful. And there's a certain egalitarianism in dress that goes with Pacific Northwest, Silicon Valley, and Silicon Forest even more. Don't confuse Silicon Forest with Silicon Valley if you're out there. The last thing I want to mention is I think that we are less civilized. This is what I talked about with my guest in part than in the 1970s, like at the height of the Apollo project. And how I judge that is my family took a bus from Peshawar, Pakistan to Kabul, Afghanistan, and then we boarded an Aeroflot and flew to Tashkent. We were coming from India. We crossed the border at Kashmir. The things we did as just a family, a nuclear family, Americans, you can't do that safely now at all. And the Khyber Pass is like totally militarized, if I'm not mistaken. If I were to go there today, I wouldn't recognize it, would I? And I think, what people see of Americans anymore, after World War II, it was a flood of tourists, and they stayed in the bed and breakfast, like Airbnb kind of thing. And the Germans are great people, we discovered. Too bad we couldn't have skipped right to that, right? And skipped the part in between. Turned out the Germans and the Americans were going to get along now. But, where is the tourist today? The tourism that most people experience now, a lot of people from America, is they're in camo and they're pumped up to hate and fear you both. And here you are at their front door, and you're not like a tourist. It was much more innocuous when they came with their Kodaks, right? Now they come with their whatever. I'm just saying, if we get back to tourism, I'll start thinking we're getting more civilized. Bus tours of Iraq, bus tours of Iran, right? Start getting in that market, and you'll see a better future. I think you can count on it. But who does tourism these days, right? Not like that, not to those places, right? There's so many scary places now. And the only Americans that are allowed to go there have to represent, cruelty, basically. Now, that's kind of been undermined back here. They say they'd rather fight the war over there than back here. But, I think the business plot kind of succeeded and the Constitution went down in flames. And so I call that kind of a war. It's not clear that the military won, right? Kind of got conned, really. Not that hard to do, maybe. I don't know. Maybe it's not over. I don't know. Anyway, the last thing I'll say is as far as teaching object-oriented programming, which is what I know a lot about, I think using the polyhedrons as your paradigm objects that then have subclasses, that's important. how we categorize them, platonics and so on, pull them out of the database based on tags and so on. You can treat polyhedra as populating a SQLite database, for example, and put their vertices in one table and do relational stuff. I've done that. I've got that all online. Like, these are not ideas I'm thinking ahead on. These are ideas I'm looking back on. But then just making polyhedra be your paradigm objects to help, you know, stick together two parts of the curriculum. It's topology, right? We want this and this to connect. So here they're learning about shapes and V plus F equals E plus 2 and sphere packing. And here we are learning object-oriented programming. What's a good idea of an object? We can do animals. I do dogs all the time, but can we also do polyhedrons? And anyway, on a computer CAD program, isn't a dog shape a bunch of polyhedrons, right? People are like, why would we do polyhedrons? How are they relevant? And it's like, look around, right? You live in a physical world. It's made out of shapes, isn't it? Okay, I guess that's kind of a hodgepodge. I'm looking forward to more work with coding with kids. I'm sorry I didn't make to the onboarding here. I've got to work. I've got to get this OSCON stuff thought through more. The cryptocurrency thing, huge. I'm not going to talk about that now. Too much to think about. I'm overwhelmed.